Good morning, everyone. Yesterday, we have started with the point that is ethical issues in clinical trials, and we have seen some of the declaration that is Nuremberg trial, then Declaration of Helsinki, and third one is the Belmont report. The Nuremberg Code is the result of the trials that were conducted in Nuremberg on the war criminals of Nazi regime, and the Belmont report it is a result of the Tuskegee syphilis study which was carried out in United States of America. So we have started studying with the core principles of clinical trial ethics. So there are basically three principles involved. First one is justice to the individuals on which we are carrying out the clinical trials. The next is respect for the person. The third one is beneficence and the non-maleficence. So non-maleficence means non-harming. So whatever clinical trials where you will consider, they should not deliberately harm the person. So they should maximize the benefits to the individuals who are participating. Then also we should minimize the harms which are associated with the clinical trials, and we should avoid any wrongdoings, and also we should not harm the individuals who participate in the clinical trials. Okay, so principles of ethical research, the components of it. So essential elements of the ethical research. So risk should be balanced with that of benefits. So it means that always benefits should outweigh the risk. Okay, that means benefits should always be more than the risk associated with the treatment. Okay, so we have to minimize the risk to the subjects. Also, at the same time, we have to maximize the benefits to individual subjects and to the society at large. So benefit should be proportional to or outweigh the risk. Okay, so non-maleficence and the beneficence is what we are talking about. Okay, so essentiality. Okay, essentiality means what? We have to conduct the clinical trials only and only if it is essential to carry out it. Okay, if there is no need of clinical trials, such as in case of certain drugs, where a certain type of drug is already being tested in the human beings, a similar category of drugs, if it is introduced, then we don't have to carry out the extensive clinical trials. Okay, we can carry out small trials and then we can generalize it. Okay, so test on human beings we have to carry out only if it is absolutely essential. So if does all current research certify that the drug is safe? So if current research certifies that a drug is safe, then there is no need of carrying out the clinical trials. So non-exploitation. So we have studied one of the most important issue with the clinical trials is that the exploitation of the individuals or the volunteers is what we see is observed in the clinical trials. That's why the many of the regulations they ponder upon this particular thing, that is non-exploitation. So the whoever carrying out the clinical test, the investigator sponsor, they must provide some remuneration to the test subjects. They also inform the subjects about all potential side effects and the risk. Okay, so ensure ample compensation for accidental injury. So whoever participating in the clinical trials, they must have some backing in order to take part in the clinical trials. That means if anything happens to them, something should be there to back them up financially. So insurance can be taken off for the such volunteers. Then if the injury is kind of injury that causes uh, that can be recuperated, then a rehabilitation procedure should be in place. That means injury is not a very fatal, but it can certainly damage some of the organs of the patient. So in such case, rehabilitation is essential. Then lifelong support needed to be given. So if a patient takes part in the clinical trials, then in such cases, after the clinical trial gets over, that patient should get that particular drug for the lifelong purpose. Okay, so if the disease like diabetes mellitus or something like that, which is a chronic disease, and if the patient participated in such a clinical trial which tries or tests the oral hypoglycemic agent, then the patient should get that medication even after the clinical trial gets over. Okay. So next is privacy and confidentiality. So inform subjects about the extent to which the personal info would be disclosed. Okay. So do not divulge identity and records of test subjects as far as possible. Also, do not provide information which will allow identity to be guessed. Okay, so it deals with the protecting the privacy and the confidentiality of the personal information of the patient who participated in the clinical trials. Okay, so next is precaution. So design the study such as the risk to the subjects is minimized. Ensure there are no adverse side effects. Okay, so this is not possible that to avoid adverse effect as such. There should there will be some side effects associated with the treatment, but it is our duty, or it is the investigator's duty, to ensure that whatever side effects are there or adverse effects are there, they are to the minimum. Okay, they should not be fatal in nature. Okay, so such precaution needed to be taken while carrying out the clinical trials. The next is balancing the principles. So how to balance all those principles while carrying out the clinical trials. So balancing the need for a rigorous design with the obligation to maximize benefit and minimize the harms. So basically, uh, whatever principles the clinical trials needed to follow, we have to balance. Why we have to balance? Because in order to maximize the benefits which are associated with the treatment, and we have to also minimize the risk. Okay, so when we say minimize the risk, we are talking about we have to eliminate the unnecessary risk. Okay, some kind of adverse drug reactions will be there, but that are inevitable with any kind of medication. So some unnecessary risk which we can control, that can be removed. Okay, so we can minimize the harms by that way. Okay, so in order to balance the principle, what we have to do, there is equipoise, there is balance of forces or interest. Then next we have to do randomization. Okay, we have to randomly allocate the individuals into the treatment group or standard group. The next is choice of control. Okay, the example of it is randomized control trial. Randomized control trials means what? We control the variables in this type of clinical trials. Okay, so choice of control, what is choice of control? The benefits, risk, burdens, and effectiveness of a new method should be tested against those of the best current prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic methods. Okay, so we have to compare the newer treatment with that of the current best treatment. Okay, so control, when we are talking about, we have to select the drugs which are currently available as the best treatment options. And against these best treatment options, which will act as control, we have to test our test substances. Okay. So competence. So what is competence? Professional competence. All personnel involved in trials should be trained and qualified. A strong sense of ethics is essential for personnel. That means whoever participating or whoever is designing the clinical trials, they should be competent enough to carry out the clinical trials, and while doing so, they should follow the ethical principles of the clinical trials. So next is transparency and accountability. So no aspect of the study should be hidden except for privacy reasons. Okay, so except for the personal information of the patients who are involved in the clinical trial study, no aspect of the study should be hidden. Okay, so no manipulation should be done in the clinical trial studies. Okay, so prior disclosure of all conflicts of interest is essential. So we have the sponsors need to maintain permanent records of all the research data and the notes. Then fix responsibilities for the study and its outcomes. Okay, so various hierarchy levels in the clinical trial study design we have to first of all determine, and then so one hierarchy levels are defined, the roles and responsibilities of the person at each of the hierarchy levels, they need to be defined so that whatever are outcomes of the clinical trial, we have to ascertain those outcomes will have relevance to the roles and responsibilities of the clinical trial person. Okay, then burden of proof is always with those who conduct the trial. Okay, so it is the sponsor, investigator, and other stakeholders who perform the clinical trial. They carry the burden of proof. That means whatever carried out clinical research, the proof of it needs to be provided by those who conduct the trial. It is not, nobody is going to ask the patients whether the clinical trials were conducted as per the norms and as per the procedures. It is the one, all the stakeholders who conduct the clinical trial, they need to provide the appropriate proof in order to uh, give the justify the data or prove the credibility of the data generated by the clinical trials. Then distributive justice. So benefits of research should be equally distributed. So no, uh, what to say, no discrimination should be done whenever the benefits of the study they are to be they are proved. Okay, so this is not always seen. You can see many of the medications which are developed, they are first of all introduced into the United States of America, and many of those medications they don't even see the light in the India. The reason is that the amount which is being paid by those medication in USA is a lot much than that of the that is being paid in India, and also there are certain patent problems in India. That's why this is either it is the ideal condition, but it is not being followed. Okay, so research on genetics should not lead to racial inequalities. So do not conduct research on economically weak sections to create an advantage for those that are better off. So that's why the India have become the hub for the clinical trial studies, and also the China, many of the companies they conduct their clinical trials in China. The reason is that the compensation which is to be given to the volunteers who participated in the clinical trials in these countries, it is very less as compared to the compensation which is to be given to the patients in the developed countries. So these companies they use these sites for their conducting the clinical trials, and once the clinical trial gets over, they don't give the benefits of that drug to the patients who were recruited in the trial, Instead, they use the same drugs in the developed developed countries and get the maximum economic benefit out of it. Okay. The next is avoid implicit coercion. Coercion means what? Forcefully, we don't have to force anyone into getting into the clinical trials. That is, do not enroll people at a disadvantage in the study. That is, prisoners, students, subordinates, or employees. Okay, so ensure complete freedom of choice when they are enrolled. Okay, the next is patient rights. So use in the country after approval. Okay, so drug is marketed only in the affluent countries. That's what I already told you, that the clinical are conducted in third world countries, and after clinical trial gets over, the drug is marketed in the developed countries instead of the countries in which it was used in clinical trials. Okay, so insist on drug would be released in India also at a price that is reasonable. So, in Indian perspective, if any company is carrying out clinical trial in India, the Indian government or regulation should also mandate to that company should introduce the same drug in India at affordable cost. Okay. So next is patient rights, vulnerability of patient in a trial. So what there are many vulnerabilities of the patient which make or which compel the patient to take part in the clinical trials. So the first vulnerability is money paid or compensation which is given. Okay, so some economically weaker patients, by means of the money paid which is being paid in the clinical trials, they take part in the clinical trials. They do not know the risk associated with the clinical trials, but just for the sake of money, just for the sake of compensation, they take part in the clinical trials. Okay. Then next is healthcare to the family. Okay, so this is the second vulnerability the patients have. That is, uh, during clinical trials, the sponsor they tend to give some type of what to say. Um, they provide insurance to the family members also of the patient. So, keeping that in mind, patient they take part in the clinical trials. Then free medicines at the hospital. So this is the third one. Then fourth one is free diagnostic test. Okay. Then fifth one is the counter to the cardinal principle of autonomy. Okay. The next is not to be compelled or unfairly enticed to participate. So is it a truly a free choice when we consider all these vulnerability? So just these companies, big pharmaceuticals, they show some kind of or they compel the patient to take part into the clinical trial, telling them all these benefits of the taking part into the clinical trial. So it is like a marketing gimmick that is being used by the big pharmaceutical companies to enroll the patients. But when all of these things are already told to the patient in advance, it changes the minds of the patient, and as the mind of the patient changes, the patient are compelled to take part into it. So it is not really a true choice of the patient by which they are taking part into the clinical trials. It is all these vulnerabilities, the big pharmaceutical companies they take advantage of all of this, and they compel the patient to take part into the clinical trials. The next is patients enrolled in clinical trials when trials are closed. So many of the times it happens that just to fill up the number of the patients who have enrolled into the clinical trial, patients are enrolled into the trial when the trials are closed. Okay, so numbers are completed because of recruitment of patient in other countries. Okay, so it is important to ensure that all persons in the trial receive their drugs. It should be built in safeguard when approving a clinical trial. So it is a regulator's duty to ensure that whoever gets enrolled into the clinical trial, they should get their medication. Okay, so many of times it happens that some kind of form is being filled up by the patient. They sign on that particular form, and they are never contacted again by the pharmaceutical companies. Okay, so they take these consent forms, and they usually do it backdated forms, so that they can show that these many patients participated in the clinical trial, just to improve the data. They do this particular malpractice. Okay, so next is access to drugs. So participants, as they cannot afford the drugs, the access to the drugs which are being used in the clinical trial should be given to the patients who become volunteers. Okay, so they should be able to obtain at a reduced price or entirely free. So whoever participated in the clinical trial, they should get the medications at free of cost, or they can they should pay the very little price to purchase those medications. Okay. The next is the information. So no information is ever provided about the outcome. So must be provided not only to the participants of the trial but also to the community. So usually it happens that the clinical trial gets over, the data is submitted to the FDA. FDA takes some decision, but whatever decision related to that medication is never communicated to the participants of the clinical trial. So, which is morally very wrong, that participants have the right to know what has happened to the drug which they were taking as a clinical trial subject. Okay, so information must be provided by the sponsor to the patients. The next is use of the placebos. So it is unethical to give a placebo to a group of patients when there is a drug available to cure. So when placebo is given, we are actually dividing the patient from access to the therapy. And if the disease is very chronic disease or a fatal disease, so in those cases, this use of placebo it becomes highly unethical and highly controversial. So there is no role for a placebo in conditions for which there is already an effective drug. Okay, so like in case of coronavirus disease, as there was no drug available in the market, all the drugs were investigational drugs. So in such cases, use of placebo is can be justified. But if in case of if a drug which is to be tested, if it is a oral hypoglycemic agent, we have many of the drugs, established drugs in the market. So any of the established drug we can take, and we can actually check the our investigational new drug against such established drug. Okay, in such cases we should not go for placebos. Okay, so example of the use of placebo is evaluation of new drugs for the diabetes. So same established oral hypoglycemic agent we have to use as the control, and test substance will act as test group. Okay, then example of this, in this particular study, the ethics were not followed. That is single dose perinatal nevirapine plus standard zidovudine to prevent mother to child transmission of HIV-1 in Thailand. Okay, so this study was designed to test the superiority of nevirapine regime over placebo regime. regimen. Okay, so critics uh, they pointed out one particular point, that is use of placebo, and they find it is unethical to use the placebo when the already established medication is in the market. So supporters say that poor countries can anyway never afford the expensive AZT regimen, and the shorter treatments were needed. Okay, so it was argued for local standard of care. So as in Thailand, they supporters argued that they cannot afford these medication. That's why they use the placebos. Okay, so they were actually uh, supporting this unethical practice by saying that, arguing that it is local standard of care which is very poor. That's why they use the placebos instead of actual drug. So there are special group of patients we have to take special care. And its first group is pregnant or nursing women. We have already discussed about it in special population, drug use in special population, only for research to better the health of pregnant or nursing women, fetus or infants. So only in certain cases only restricted studies allow use of pregnant or nursing women. Okay, so also while doing so, while using this particular special population for the clinical trials, we have to ensure that there is no risk to the fetus or infant. Okay. The next special group is children. So they are to be used for only trials for drugs to improve child health. The drugs which are to be used in adults, we don't have to recruit the children for it. Okay, so only conduct trials on children after phase 3 clinical trials on adults. Okay, so once we have established the efficacy and safety of the drug in the adults, we have to conduct the trials in the children. So exception is drugs for diseases only affecting children. So if certain diseases they are prevalent in the children, in those cases only we can enroll the children as for the clinical trials. So consent for from parents and or legal guardians is mandatory. Consent from child in the case of mature minors and adolescents. Okay, so those who are above the age 12 or have reached to the age 18, in those cases we have to take consent from the child. Otherwise we have to take consent from the parents or legal guardians. Okay, so there is exception to these, that except where parents have given consent and there is no other medical alternative to the tested therapy. In such cases, no need to take consent from the child of age, that is mature minors and adolescents. Then respect for children. Declaration of Helsinki says that obtain informed consent from parents, and if child is capable of giving consent, then obtain assent from the child itself. Okay, the National Commission in 1977 and 1979 says that parental permission, but within limits. It should protect the child's health and safety, that is beneficial should be seen while including the children in the clinical trials, and child's assent, that is it's not as a right but a benefit, so nurture child's moral growth and developing autonomy. So we should not entirely ignore child while giving, while including children into the clinical trial. We have to also explain the things to the child so that child can decide for their own and can give the consent to the clinical trials. It will help in the nurturing the moral growth of the child, and also it will help in the developing the autonomy. Then two pillars of ethics are informed consent process and the institutional ethics committee. So this concept of a ethics committee, it is introduced by the Declaration of Helsinki. So what is informed consent? Subject should consent to participate in the study. So this informed consent, what it is made up of two, that is informed and consent. Informed means what? The patients who are going to participate in the clinical study, they are informed about risk and benefits of the clinical trials in which they are going to participate. Once everything is explained in clear words to the patient, and if patient agrees to participate in the clinical trial, that means patient gives consent to participate in the clinical trial, then such process is known as informed consent. Okay, so subject should be fully informed about the objectives of the study. Subjects have the right to withdraw at any point during the study. Mhm. So no refund of remuneration should be demanded on early withdrawal. So subjects, the patients have every right to withdraw from the study. They should not give any kind of reason that why they are withdrawing from the study. If they want to withdraw from the study, they can withdraw, and whatever remuneration paid to them, the sponsors or the clinical trial coordinators, they cannot ask for the refund of the same. Then in Indian scenario, informed consent situation is like this. Getting informed consent is difficult in developing countries like us. 30% each consented after full or partial disclosure. Significant gender difference with fewer females consenting to participate. So P is equal to 0.043. So understanding of consent is poor. Okay. So this one paper I have cited, that is by B. Gitanjali et al. So this paper actually informs us about what is the Indian situation related to informed consent process. Ethics committee, which is as mandated by the Declaration of Helsinki, it takes independent review of the clinical research and ensures the public that investigator biases have not distorted the approach, that ethical requirements have been fulfilled, and that subjects will not be exploited. So, three things this ethics committee ensures. First thing is that the investigator biases have not distorted the approach. So, what is investigator biases? That means whatever recruitment of the patients have been done, randomization is done of that particular recruited patient. That means uh, it the investigator won't decide on their personal opinion that whom to be kept in the group and whom to be kept in the test group. So there will be no bias in that. Okay, that will be ensured by the institutional ethics committee. Then also the whatever ethical requirements the clinical trials has, they have been fulfilled. And third thing, that it ensures that subjects will not be exploited. So subjects are not shown, um, uh, subjects vulnerabilities are not identified, and the things which will cater to those vulnerabilities are not being catered, are not being shown, are not being offered by the sponsor to the patient so that they can enroll into the clinical trials. So such type of exploitation is to be avoided, and that is ensured by the institutional ethics committee. So this ethics committee, it can minimize the conflict of interest, and also it can make the stakeholders of the clinical trials accountable to the public. So this is the composition of it. So it is multi-sectorial and multidisciplinary in nature. So the chairperson preferably from outside the institution, then one to two basic medical scientists. So when we are saying institution, we are basically talking about the institute or the hospital where the clinical research is being carried out. So it will consist of one to two basic medical scientists, then one to two clinicians from various institutes, then one legal expert or retired judge. Then next is one social scientist, then one philosopher or a ethicist, then one layperson from community, and one member secretary to look after the uh, or to look after the agenda and minutes of meeting of the this particular committee. Okay, then criteria for the IAC review is that first criteria is risk which are associated with the treatment, they need to be minimized. Second is the risk are justified by the anticipated benefit. So even if the risks are associated with the treatment, they should be justified with anticipated benefits. The next is subjects will be selected and treated fairly. The next is informed consent is adequate. Okay, so four things are there: a risk to be minimized. Second is if risks are there, they should be justified by anticipated benefits. Third thing is that subjects will be selected randomly and they to be treated fairly. And fourth is informed consent process is followed. So clinical trials, we have already studied the phases. So phase one, phase two, phase three, and phase four. So phase one is human pharmacology. Phase two is for the therapeutic exploratory trials. Then phase three is for the therapeutic confirmatory trials, and the phase four is post-marketing trials. So trials in India, the concerns which we have is that lack of formal training in bioethics and research methodology. So no course in India, it ponders upon these two things, that is what are bioethics and the research methodology. The next is heavy burden of the clinical duties. So whoever doctors who are participating in the clinical research, they apart from the carrying out clinical research, they have other duties also, so heavy burden is there. Then suboptimal administrative support is there. So hospital in which we are conducting the clinical trials, so the management of it is least supporting to the clinical trials. Then a lack of regulation of the private trials, so no one actually cares for uh, if private trials are going on. Then variation in the requirement for informed consent, and lastly lack of proper ethics review. Then next concerns in trials in India is that quality of clinical research. It is because the quality of the personnel available, the qualified personnel is not there. And then next timelines for the regulatory approval is also great. Then a deficiency in the functioning of the ethics committee, then an unethical approach to the recruitment of the trial subjects. So catering to the vulnerabilities of the individuals, the clinical trials are these subjects are being recruited in clinical trials. So next concerns are limited awareness amongst investigators, that do all studies require ethics committee clearance. So the investigators only then don't know whether all the studies require ethics clearance or not. Then documents which are need to be submitted against it is not known by the investigator. And also investigators are not very sure that whether EC looks at the scientific aspects of the clinical trial or not. Then they are also not very well aware of the requirements of the regulatory clearances. So why India is a preferred destination for carrying out clinical trials? Because we have technically competent workforce, then patient availability due to very large population, the cost associated with recruitment is also low, then drug control system is also a friendly one. Okay, Then the benefits which trials in India provides are participation by Indian researchers and clinicians. Then it provides platform for carrying out clinical trials. Then also it helps in creating the expertise in the field. Then also it increases job opportunities, and lastly it brings the resources into the countries. That means newer drug can come into the countries and can be used for the treatment purpose. So the challenges which we have in Indian perspective is that research ethics, as it is a new specialty, then informed consent process, then very great hurdle uh, in clinical trials in India. That is, several inherent difficulties are present. Illiteracy is one of them. That is too many languages, so language barrier. The lack of time for health professional to explain. So as population is more, the burden on the health professional is also more. So they get very less time to explain each and every part of the uh, that clinical trials to the subjects. Then bioethics education, it is not in the curriculum. Then boom in clinical research has not been matched by regulatory reform and ethical practices. So this clinical research field, it is expanding in very geometric progression, but the regulatory reforms are not been able to match that particular progression of the clinical trials in India. So next challenges related to ethics committee in India are no separate funds are allocated to the ethics committee. Then space crunch is also there, that is documentation and the archiving of this documentation is very difficult. So we don't know exactly where to store all the documents related to the clinical trials due to the space crunch. Then infrequent meetings. So it the meeting frequency is not proper. Then limited resources for monitoring studies, and lastly, not all research studies undergo review. So complexities in Indian context, it include it is a developing country. Then socio-economic considerations are there. There is social level and economic levels of the people. It is also one of the consideration. Then healthcare availability and access to the healthcare, it is also questionable. Then literacy rate and the education status also creates a hurdle in informed consent process. Then conflicts of interest have, that means even though we have studied the seen the ethics committee constitution, the scientists they work on behalf of these big pharmaceutical companies, even though they should not show any kind of bias. Then guinea pig perception is there, that the whoever participants are being enrolled into the clinical trials, they they have this perception that we have been used as guinea pigs for these new medications. Then questions about clinical trials in India are there. Then acceptability of Indian data, due to all of these points, whatever data is being generated in Indian trials, it is uh, have less credibility. And also issues of post trial assessments, once the clinical trial gets over, the access to the medication is still the question. Okay, so and that's all for the point, that is ethics in clinical research. Thank you.